Picture this. It's the late 1970s, and Quebec, a Canadian province, is caught up in a chaotic battle. The Hells Angels and their fierce rivals, the Outlaws, are locked in a brutal war over who gets to control the booming drug trade. It's a nasty fight, and hundreds of people, many of them innocent bystanders, get caught in the crossfire. Both gangs gain a reputation for being extremely cruel and ruthless, using every brutal method they can think of. When the dust finally clears, 23 outlaws are dead, and shockingly, one guy is responsible for killing 18 of them. His name? Yves Apache Trudeau. He's the Hells Angels' top hitman, known for having no conscience and no respect for human life. Trudeau had no problem using any method to take down his targets, whether that meant shooting, beating, stabbing, or even strangling them. He even scalped a victim once, earning himself the nickname Apache. But what he really loved using were explosives, being an expert at demolitions. He didn't care who was nearby, wives, kids, or anyone else. If you could be a witness or get in his way, you were gone, just like that. But life as an outlaw biker is all about double crosses and backstabbing. Despite all his work for the Hells Angels, Trudeau eventually found himself betrayed by the very gang he served. His sharp instincts and constant sense of danger barely helped him escape a shocking attack that could have ended him. Trudeau's story begins during a time known as the Great Darkness in Quebec, stretching from 1936 to 1960. Back then, the province was under the tight grip of the ultra-conservative National Union Party, which enforced strict Catholic and traditional values. But everything changed in 1960 when the Quebec Liberals took over and made big changes, transforming Quebec from one of the most conservative places in North America to one of the most liberal. With these changes, many young people in Quebec started embracing a wild, free-spirited lifestyle. Teen pregnancies and drug use skyrocketed, far outpacing the rest of Canada. Outlaw motorcycle clubs became a popular way for young guys to rebel against the norms, and by 1968, there were over 350 biker gangs in Quebec alone. With so many gangs battling over territory, the murder rate soared. A crime journalist from that time even said, "There's always been more violence in Quebec in the biker world. It's called the Red Zone." An outlaw's hitman once admitted to him that he was terrified of setting foot in Montreal. In this rough and rowdy scene, a 22-year-old Yves Trudeau joined the Popeyes Motorcycle Club. Based in Montreal, the Popeyes were knee-deep in all sorts of shady business, racketeering, loan sharking, drug deals, and even carrying out hits for the powerful Montreal Mafia. As the second biggest biker gang in Canada, their reputation for violence and chaos caught the eye of the Hells Angels, who were looking to stretch their reach into Canada. But the Hells Angels weren't the only ones with their sights set on the north. Their rivals, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, were also making moves. The Outlaws teamed up with Satan's Choice, a biker gang based in Ontario that held the title of Canada's largest biker club. With backing from the Outlaws, Satan's Choice expanded into Montreal, which put them head-to-head with the Popeyes. It wasn't long before tensions exploded into what became Canada's first big biker gang war. The Satan's Choice Popeyes War raged on for 2 years, claiming over 20 lives. Both gangs received serious backup from their American allies, turning the whole thing into a sort of proxy war between the Outlaws and the Hells Angels. During this period, Yves Trudeau made a name for himself as the Popeyes' top hitman, taking out numerous members of Satan's Choice. The war eventually came to a standstill, with both sides beaten down by heavy police crackdowns and many of their key members, including their leaders, ending up behind bars. Feeling the pressure, Satan's Choice officially joined forces with the Outlaws in July 1977. Just 5 months later, the Hells Angels managed to convince the Popeyes to become the first official Hells Angels chapter in Canada. Yves Trudeau quickly became one of the founding members of this new chapter. But as soon as the ink was dry on the deal, tensions started flaring up again between the two rival gangs. Anytime members from the Hells Angels and Outlaws crossed paths, it often led to fights. All this tension came to a head on February 17, 1978. On that day, two outlaws dressed in full gang colors walked into a bar known to be under the Hells Angels' protection. They drank at the bar until a group of angels threw them out. The outlaws, furious, stood outside, shouting insults at the angels. That's when Yves Trudeau pulled up in his car right beside the outlaws and opened fire. He killed one of them and wounded the other. This violent act was the spark that lit the fuse, officially kicking off a new wave of war between the gangs. What became known as the First Biker War in Quebec quickly spiraled into a wave of targeted killings and bombings. Just a month into this violent conflict, Yves Trudeau struck a major blow against the outlaws by planting a bomb under the car of their president in Montreal, taking him out. Not stopping there, a few months later, he went to the home of another outlaw's leader, knocked on his door, and shot him point blank when he answered. Over the following months, Trudeau continued his deadly spree, picking off key Outlaws members one by one. Meanwhile, the Hells Angels suffered just one injury, a member grazed in a failed drive-by shooting. The lopsided losses hit the Outlaws' morale hard. Seeing his gang spirit sink, a high-ranking Outlaws member named Roxy Du Temple realized they needed a decisive win to turn things around. On October 12, 1978, Yves Buteau, the national president of Hells Angels Canada, met with Walter Stadnick, leader of an Ontario gang called the Wild Ones. Buteau's goal was to bring Stadnick's gang into the Hells Angels fold, hoping to expand their influence into Ontario and gain an edge in the war. But the meeting, held at a bar, was suddenly interrupted when two Outlaws members burst in, guns blazing, a pistol, and a sawed-off shotgun. The ambush left one Hells Angels member and two Wild Ones dead, with two other Angels seriously injured. Buteau and Stadnick managed to escape unharmed. After the attack, Buteau quickly found out that Du Temple was the mastermind behind it. Furious, he ordered Trudeau to make Du Temple his #1 target. A month later, Trudeau spotted a man who looked like Du Temple walking down the street. He approached the man and asked in French, "Are you Roxy?" When the man didn't respond, Trudeau shot him in the back of the head without a second thought. But the next day, when he read the newspaper, he realized he'd killed the wrong person, a German tourist named William Wycold, who had no ties to the biker world and didn't understand French, which is why he hadn't replied. Trudeau, showing no remorse, reportedly laughed hysterically upon reading this, though he was disappointed that the Hells Angels refused to pay him for the hit. He even argued that anyone resembling Du Temple should be killed just to be safe, but the Angels weren't on board with that idea. 4 months later, Trudeau finally got his real target, planting another car bomb that successfully took out Du Temple. But even as they celebrated this win, new rumors began to surface. Buteau caught wind that a local gang called the Huns might be planning to join forces with the Outlaws, signaling that this deadly game of alliances and betrayals was far from over. After hearing about the possible alliance between the Huns and the Outlaws, Yves Buteau wasted no time. He sent Yves Trudeau to take out the Huns' leader, and Trudeau did what he did best. He knocked on the leader's door and shot him in the head as soon as he answered. Trudeau's deadly efficiency didn't stop there. He continued to eliminate several more key figures in the Outlaws, earning even more respect from Buteau. His loyalty and skills were so highly valued that Buteau tasked him with starting a new Hells Angels chapter in Laval, a city just north of Montreal. The Laval chapter quickly gained a notorious reputation for its members' violent antics, regular run-ins with the law, and heavy drug use. Trudeau himself fell deep into cocaine addiction, at one point blowing through $60,000 worth of coke in just 3 months. But even with his addiction, Trudeau's reputation as the top hitman in Montreal never wavered. His precision and knack for staying under the radar made him the go-to guy for sensitive jobs. In 1982, Buteau gave Trudeau one of the most delicate assignments yet. The Hells Angels had a critical alliance with the West End Gang, a powerful Irish-Canadian crew that controlled the port of Montreal, making it a key gateway for smuggling drugs. Frank Ryan, the leader of the West End Gang, approached the Angels with a serious issue. He had discovered that 2 Hells Angels members were plotting to kidnap his children to erase a debt they owed him for cocaine. Furious, Ryan demanded that the Angels deal with these rogue members immediately or risk losing access to the drugs the West End Gang imported. Knowing that time was running out, Buteau needed to get rid of these 2 members quickly and quietly. If the rest of the Hells Angels found out he was ordering the death of their own, it could spark a dangerous rebellion within the club. So he turned to Trudeau. Trudeau invited the 2 men out for drinks, got them drunk, and then drove them to a secluded area. There, he shot them both in the head and dumped their bodies into the St. Lawrence River, ensuring that the problem was handled without attracting unwanted attention. Despite setbacks like this, the Hells Angels were winning the war against the Outlaws. The Outlaws seemed unable to keep up with the Angels' relentless attacks. But in 1983, everything changed when Buteau himself fell victim to an ambush. As he was taking a smoke break outside a restaurant, an Outlaws member shot him twice in the chest with a .38 caliber handgun, killing him instantly. His death was a major blow to the Hells Angels, and it set off shockwaves within the gang. Buteau's funeral was a massive affair, with over 150 Hells Angels members attending from across Canada, the United States, and even Europe. However, it nearly turned into a bloodbath. The day after the funeral, a young boy stumbled upon a hidden bomb that had been placed along the funeral procession route. Luckily, the bomb had malfunctioned, but police suspected it had been planted by the Outlaws as one final act of defiance. Buteau's death left a power vacuum, setting the stage for the next chapter in the violent struggle between these rival gangs. Despite the shocking death of Yves Buteau, the Outlaws still couldn't turn the tide in their favor. Later in 1983, the Hells Angels struck back by successfully assassinating the new president of the Outlaws Montreal chapter, along with 2 of his top lieutenants. By mid-1984, the Angels had inflicted so much damage that the Outlaws decided to abandon Quebec entirely, retreating to their stronghold in Ontario. This left the Hells Angels as the dominant force in Quebec, controlling the drug trade unchallenged. But even though the war with the Outlaws had ended, Yves Trudeau's deadly skills were still in demand. In late 1984, he received a request from the new leader of the West End Gang, Alan the Weasel Ross. Ross wanted revenge for the murder of his predecessor, Frank Ryan, who had been betrayed and killed by 4 members of his own gang. Ross found out that the 4 men had been openly bragging about their crime, so he turned to Trudeau to handle them. This mission would become one of Trudeau's most notorious. He discovered that the 4 targets were hiding in a downtown Montreal apartment building, primarily used as student housing for Concordia University. Knowing that they rarely left the apartment, Trudeau devised a cunning plan. He sent an associate with gifts for the group, a TV, a VCR, and a videotape of Hell's Angels Forever, a propaganda film created by the Hell's Angels Manhattan chapter. Unbeknownst to the four men, Trudeau had hidden a bomb inside the TV. When it detonated, the explosion ripped through the apartment, killing all four targets and badly damaging the surrounding units, putting their neighbors at risk too. Despite the Angels' victory in the First Biker War, internal conflicts were starting to tear them apart. The Laval chapter, known for their heavy drug use and reckless behavior, had become a major problem. Many members of the Southern Montreal chapter, as well as the newly appointed Hells Angels Canada president, Michel Langlois, felt that Laval's antics were giving the entire organization a bad name. Under Buteau's leadership, the Laval chapter had been officially banned from using the drugs they sold, but many members, including Trudeau, had ignored this rule, indulging heavily. Things only worsened when Laurent Villot, a known alcoholic and cocaine user, took over as president. With him at the helm, the Laval chapter's drug use spiraled out of control. Not only did they start using the very drugs they were supposed to sell, but they also embezzled profits meant for the club. Their careless behavior led to frequent run-ins with the police over minor offenses, putting the entire Hells Angels operation in Quebec at risk. Other criminal groups, including the West End Gang and the Rizzuto crime family, also saw the Laval chapter as a liability and pressured the Hells Angels to rein them in. The tension reached a boiling point when Hells Angels from across Canada demanded action against the out-of-control Laval chapter. Peter Carroll, the president of the Halifax chapter, even traveled to Montreal to meet with Régent Lessard, the leader of the Southern Montreal chapter. During their meeting, Carroll insisted that something had to be done to bring the Laval chapter back in line, warning that their behavior could jeopardize the entire Hells Angels organization in Quebec. With pressure mounting from all sides, it became clear that the Laval chapter's wild ways could no longer be ignored, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation within the ranks of the Angels. Peter Carroll's meeting with Régent Lessard took an unexpected turn when Lessard fully agreed that the Laval chapter needed to be dealt with. Lessard vented about how the Laval members had become a menace and a threat to the existence of the Hells Angels in Quebec. Georges Beaulieu, president of the Sherbrooke chapter, was also at the meeting, and together, the three leaders decided that drastic action was necessary. The Laval chapter had to be eliminated. In March 1985, they organized a secret meeting where the Laval chapter was declared in bad standing, meaning they were marked for death. Lessard, Carroll, and Beauboy came up with a plan. They would invite the Laval members to a party at the Sherbrooke chapter's clubhouse. The event would be attended by members from the Southern Montreal, Sherbrooke, and Halifax chapters, making it seem like a regular gathering. However, this party had a dark purpose. They decided the fate of each Laval member. 2 would be forced into retirement, another 2 would get a chance to join the Southern Montreal chapter, and the rest, including Yves Trudeau, were marked for execution. Carroll and Lessard were particularly eager to see Trudeau dead, considering him a dangerous and unpredictable drug addict. Even though attendance at the party was mandatory, Trudeau had a bad feeling about it. Trusting his instincts, he checked himself into a drug detox facility in Oka, Quebec, just a week before the event, dodging the trap. The rest of the Laval chapter showed up at the Sherbrooke clubhouse, where they were ambushed by Lessard and 41 other Angels. The Laval members were herded into a small room and executed. This event became known as the Lennoxville Massacre, shocking and appalling many in the criminal world. One person particularly disgusted by the massacre was Salvatore Cazzetta, a powerful figure in the biker scene. He saw the mass killing as a betrayal of the outlaw code. Instead of joining the Hells Angels as he had initially planned, he started his own group called the Rock Machine. 9 years later, This new gang would challenge the Hells Angels in a brutal battle for control of Quebec's drug trade, igniting the infamous Quebec Biker War, the bloodiest biker conflict in history. Trudeau remained oblivious to the massacre's details until a member of the Montreal chapter visited him with bad news. He was expelled from the gang and now had a target on his back. But there was a way out. If he killed the only other Laval member who had survived the massacre, Jean-Marc Donahue, the gang's chief accountant. Trudeau tracked Donahue down in March 1985, strangling him to death and leaving his body in the trunk of a car on an abandoned street. However, Trudeau's troubles didn't end there. A month later, he was arrested on a weapons charge and sentenced to a year in prison. While behind bars, he learned that his life was still in danger. Despite the Montreal chapter agreeing to spare him in exchange for killing Donahue, rumors circulated that the Angels had secretly placed a $50,000 bounty on his head. Trudeau found himself caught in a web of betrayal, realizing that his former brothers weren't done with him yet. After realizing that the Hells Angels were actively plotting his death while he was in prison, Yves Trudeau decided to become a police informant and government witness, seeing it as his only chance for survival. He struck a deal, agreeing to testify against his former gang members in exchange for a safer prison arrangement and a reduced sentence. His testimony proved highly valuable to law enforcement, directly leading to the conviction of 39 Hells Angels members, including key figures like Michel Langlois, the Hells Angels Canada president. Langlois, facing imminent arrest, fled to Morocco, creating a leadership vacuum in the organization. This power void within the Hells Angels eventually allowed Maurice "Mom" Boucher, a fiercely ambitious and brutal figure, to rise to prominence. Boucher's ascent set the stage for his leadership of the Hells Angels during the brutal Quebec Biker War, where he would shape the group's future and tactics in their ongoing battle for control of the province's criminal underworld. As part of his cooperation with authorities, Trudeau also helped solve 90 unsolved murders. However, his assistance placed the government in a difficult position. Out of those 90 cases, he confessed to being the perpetrator in 43 of them. These included 33 killings of rival gangsters, but also 10 innocent civilians. He further admitted involvement in 29 shootings, 10 bombings, 3 beatings, 1 strangulation, and 15 attempted murders. In a controversial plea deal, Trudeau agreed to plead guilty to 43 counts of manslaughter, which significantly reduced his potential punishment. In exchange, he received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after just 7 years. The agreement also provided Trudeau with a relatively comfortable prison life. He was housed in a special cell, paid $40,000 over 4 years, and received a weekly allowance of $35 for cigarettes. This arrangement sparked public outrage, with many seeing it as a failure of the justice system to properly hold him accountable for his horrific crimes. Despite the controversy, Trudeau was released from prison after serving only 9 years. Upon release, he was given a new identity and relocated to Valleyfield, a town in southwest Quebec. He attempted to maintain a low profile, working as an orderly in a nursing home and as a bus driver for people with disabilities. He entered a relationship with a woman who was unaware of his violent past, managing to live quietly for a few years. However, in 2000, things took a turn for the worse after Trudeau lost his job. He spiraled back into cocaine addiction, a habit that had plagued much of his earlier life. In 2004, he was arrested again, this time for the rape of a 14-year-old boy. He received a 4-year sentence for this crime, but due to still being on probation from his previous sentence, he was automatically resentenced to life in prison. Trudeau's attempts at a second chance at life came to an abrupt end, returning him to a life behind bars, where he remained one of the most notorious figures in Quebec's criminal history. During Yves Trudeau's trial, the judge made a chilling observation stating, "In your lifetime, you have killed more people than the entire Canadian military did in the Gulf War." The grim comparison highlighted the scale of his violent past. Following his conviction for the sexual assault of a minor, Trudeau's situation grew even more precarious. As a convicted pedophile and a known police informant, he faced serious threats to his safety. For his own protection, he was placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day with minimal human interaction. In 2006, Trudeau's health took a sharp decline when he was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. By then, he was described as a skeleton of a man who needed a wheelchair to get around and spoke in a weak, raspy voice. The once feared hitman was now a frail and diminished figure, isolated and struggling with a painful illness. He eventually succumbed to the disease, dying in 2008 at the age of 62. The news of his death was met with mixed reactions, but for many of the families of his victims, it brought a bitter sense of closure. One of them, the sister of a man he had killed, expressed her feelings bluntly, stating, "Killing to him was like buying a bag of milk. A guy like that doesn't have a soul. That cancer is justice." Her words reflected the deep pain and anger that lingered long after Trudeau's violent actions, encapsulating the complicated and haunting legacy he left behind.